Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 41, Joan of Arc, Part 2, The Militant. When Joan of Arc first came to the Dauphin's court, claiming to be sent by God, she was greeted with some skepticism. Those who believed her said that it would be foolish to turn away a miracle, while those who were more hesitant thought it just as foolish to blindly follow some random peasant girl on her word alone. Therefore, Joan was sent to Poitiers to be examined by a collection of churchmen. These men attested to Joan's basic goodness, but would not rule on whether or not she was sent by God. So Joan was asked for a sign to prove her divine mission, and the maid replied that she should be sent to Orleans, and there she would provide that sign. And, less than 2 weeks after she arrived in Orleans, the 6-month siege of the city had been relieved. Joan had given her sign. The maid wasted no time, and, days later, she was back at the Dauphin's court. Now that she had given her sign, it was time for Charles to prepare to march to Reims to be crowned. There was some pushback from members of the Dauphin's court, and the more experienced military men, who thought that Normandy or the Ile-de-France should be the next target of the Dauphinist army. But Joan got her way in the end. Still, though, even Joan recognized that immediately marching on Reims would be a mistake, with the English still swarming through the Loire valley. The decision was made to rid the central Loire of the English, and then march to Reims to finally crown Charles. While Joan got her way, she still had to cool her heels for a month, while preparations for the campaign were made. The Dauphin, ever short on money, had been forced to disband the army that Joan had led at Orleans, as he could not afford to keep it in the field. For the coming campaign, Dauphin Charles would do something that he had not done in quite some time: call upon the military nobility of the Kingdom of Bourges to serve their liege lord in the traditional feudal summons. This method of raising an army was employed by both sides throughout the first stages of the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, but was less effective with each use, causing both sides to gradually shift towards using recruiters to gather companies and hiring mercenaries. More expensive, but more reliable. The effect that Joan's appearance and the relief of Orleans had on the morale of the Dauphinists can be seen in the response to Charles's summons. Almost 5,000 men flocked to the Dauphin's banner over the coming month. While this army was not the largest that the Dauphin had ever gathered, it was a sizable force at a time where both sides in the 100 Years' War were dealing with persistent manpower shortages. And, unlike the larger armies of the past, the foreign mercenary component of this force was minimal. Not all of these men would end up joining Joan in the coming Loire campaign, as many were siphoned off to join garrisons or fight in other theaters. But this army was still a powerful force, especially when bolstered by a belief in the Maid and her holy mission. The Duke of Alencon was put in charge of the gathering force, as he had recently finished paying off his ransom from Verneuil, and could now return to the field according to the terms of his release. His wife was anxious, understandably so given how his last brush with battle went, but Joan reassured her, saying, quote, "Lady, have no fear. I shall bring him back to you in good health, and in better shape than he is now." Joan of Arc had good reason to appreciate the Dauphin's choice of overall commander. Alencon had been an early supporter of hers at court, and while she had earned the respect and even admiration of the other military commanders at the siege of Orleans, they still often refused to yield to her strategies and tactics. Alencon, on the other hand, was relatively inexperienced, a true believer, and much more willing to follow Joan's lead. In early June, Alencon and Joan, along with the Bastard of Orleans, Loire, and Poton de Xaintrailles, among others, set out to rid the Loire of the English. Their first target was the town of Jargeau, where the Duke of Suffolk and most of the English army had retreated to from Orleans. In the month since that retreat, Suffolk had spread his forces out. Some had moved to other forts and towns along the Loire, some went to Normandy, and some simply left the army. By the time that Joan and Alencon approached Jargeau, they outnumbered Suffolk around 5-1. So while the defenses of Jargeau were strong, Suffolk did not like his chances, and met with Loire to arrange a surrender. However, these terms of surrender were rejected by Alencon and Joan, and after the fighting began, when Suffolk again attempted to arrange a surrender, no one responded. Alencon later claimed not to have heard him. After spending the next morning firing on the town with their cannons, the French stormed Jargeau. Joan was at the front, holding her standard aloft, shouting, quote, "Fight hard, and God will fight with you." The English soldiers fled, and the town was taken in a day and a half. Suffolk, who never wanted this battle in the first place, was captured, and in order to save himself the embarrassment of being captured by a mere squire, the Duke of Suffolk knighted his French captor. After the fall of Jargeau, Joan's next target was the town of Beaugency-sur-Loire. As the French army began their siege of Beaugency, they were continually reinforced by other knights and soldiers who wanted to share in the glory and rally to Joan's banner. One of these knights was the Constable of France, Arthur de Richemont. Richemont had been on the outs with the Dauphin and his court for the past 2 years, and had been sulking in one of his castles while his enemy, Georges de la Tremoille, ran the court. The constable was paying close attention to the fortunes of the Dauphin's army over the past month, and saw an opportunity to wrap himself with glory and rehabilitate his reputation at court by joining the Loire campaign. So he raised a force of over 1,000 Breton troops and made his way to Beaugency. Richemont's arrival put Joan and Alencon in a bit of a bind. His soldiers could be put to good use, but the Dauphin had made it known to Alencon before he began the campaign that the constable was still persona non grata. Joan and the rest of the captains were uncertain of what to do, but they were swayed by news that an English army of 4,000 men under the command of John Falstaff was on its way to link up with the nearby armies of John Talbot and Thomas Scales and relieve Beaugency. It was decided that Richemont's men outweighed the constable's political liability. As this was all going down, the English garrison at Beaugency agreed to surrender, because, even though the French had received news of Falstaff's march to the Loire, the garrison was kept in the dark. With the fall of Beaugency, Falstaff, Scales, and Talbot were forced to reevaluate and decided to march back north. Well, fresh off their victory, Joan and the French captains decided to chase down the English. Joan of Arc, as ever, championed an aggressive approach. Quote, "In the name of God, let us go to fight, for God sent them to us, so that we might punish them," she exclaimed in a gathering of the captains after the surrender of Beaugency. And so the French were off. Loire and Poton de Xaintrailles led a veteran cavalry division in chase, and ran into the back of the English column near the village of Patay. Talbot was at the English rear, and began to organize his archers into a defensive line. But Poton and Loire were too quick, and the cavalry crashed into the archers before they could entrench. The archers who were not killed broke and fled, causing the English front, which had been forming into its own battle line, to begin to fall back. As the English line was consumed by confusion, the French vanguard appeared on the field and began an attack of their own, which broke whatever cohesion was left. Falstaff attempted to rally the fleeing English van, but those who saw him ride off assumed that he was retreating, and the rest of the English decided to retreat as well. As the English were falling back in confusion, the main body of the French army began mopping up where they could, while the French cavalry pursued Falstaff for some time. The Battle of Patay was a disaster for the English. Over 2,000 soldiers died in the battle, and well over 2,000 more were captured, including the commanders Talbot and Scales. If the relief of Orleans was the beginning of the turning point of the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Patay was where the turning point really began to turn. As news of the battle spread throughout the region, the towns which still hosted English garrisons expelled them. The English had been exorcised from the central Loire, and, even more decisively, they no longer had a field army. Over the coming weeks, as the Dauphin's soldiers advance, Bedford will be in no position to respond. The siege of Orleans had put a massive strain on England's military manpower, and the losses there and in the Loire could not be easily replaced. In the past, an interim army could be gathered from the garrisons of Lancastrian France, while a new one could be raised in England or Normandy. But now, to remove soldiers from garrisons at a time when English morale was flagging and French morale was on the rise would expose those regions to attack. And, moreover, as Joan of Arc's national mission spread throughout France, the Lancastrian government began to distrust the native Frenchmen. Before the arrival of Joan of Arc, leaving a region with few or even no garrisons was not a huge risk for the English. Over the past few years, the Dauphin had been unable to assist or support the handful of rebellions in favor of his cause which had sprung up in Lancastrian France on occasion, and seemed to be on the back foot in general. In effect, there was no Dauphinist field army in these years. There was little reason for Dauphinist partisans to rise up, only to be ignored by their king and put down by the English. After the Battle of Patay, now the English army was gone, and a French one took the field with more confidence than ever. This in turn made those in Lancastrian France, unhappy with their occupation, more willing to revolt against the English. Kelly de Vries writes, quote, "Not only were there promises of successful French military support for centers of population, especially those in the south and east of Paris, that wished to throw off English control, but at the head of the military was a holy woman, a living saint, whose presence guaranteed divine justification for their decision to go against the English." Joan's reputation as a military savior had traveled widely throughout occupied France. Her mission was well known. She had promised to relieve the siege of Orleans, and she had. And now she promised to lead the king to Reims and his coronation, and no one in France, including the English, doubted that she would. In a sign of the desperation of the English, the royal council and the Duke of Bedford commandeered a small army that was being raised to fight in a crusade against the Hussites in Bohemia. This was a serious breach of faith, literally, but to send an English army to Bohemia rather than France at this point would have been folly. As the English scrambled for men, the Dauphin's cup overfloweth. After the Loire campaign wrapped up, Richemont and his 1,000 or so men left the army as the constable was still unwelcome at court. But, as he left, another 6,000 or 7,000 soldiers were flocking to the Dauphin's banner at Gien. When Joan and Alencon returned to court with their own army, the total size of the force assembled approached 12,000 men. The Dauphin, still short on cash, could only offer these men a pittance, but that was no matter. Spirits were high, and the soldiers were there for the mission, not the pay. At Gien, Joan once more pressed for an immediate march to Reims. But the opinion of the court was still divided, and while Joan was fighting in the Loire, opposition to her plan grew. Thus far, all of Joan's campaigns had been directed against the English, but the march to Reims would take the Dauphinist army through Burgundian territory. Many of Charles's advisors, specifically the group led by Georges de la Tremoille, were pushing for reconciliation with the Duke of Burgundy, and marching a huge army through his territory could hamper those efforts. These advisors were also beginning to worry about the enthusiastic following that was coalescing around the Maid. She was becoming a player at court in her own right, and one that they could not control. Joan further alienated this faction when she first arrived at court after Patay, and petitioned the Dauphin to forgive Arthur de Richemont, de la Tremoille's great enemy. However, after Patay, Joan's air of victory and her momentum was enough to overcome whatever opposition had arisen against her planned march to Reims. But it should be noted that opposition to the Maid at court was growing, and even though Joan got her way in the end, she did have to sit on her hands for over a week as the debate raged, and then as preparations for the campaign were finalized. And many contemporaries point out Joan's frustration in the days after Patay. She always advocated for aggressive, decisive, and quick action, and that was simply not how things were done at Charles's court. But finally, in the last days of June 1429, Dauphin Charles and Joan of Arc set out from Gien for Reims. Shortly after departing, they entered the Auxerrois, Burgundian territory. At this point, the Duke of Burgundy was no longer occupied in Holland and Zealand, but he was still in the Low Countries rather than Paris or the two Burgundies. His southern territories had been covered by a truce for the past few years, and the rapidity of the collapse of English positions on the Loire came as a surprise. So the two Burgundies were not really in a position to defend themselves against the massive Dauphinist army. Therefore, when Joan and Charles demanded the submission of Auxerre, there was little that the city could do to resist. After an initial show of defiance, Georges de la Tremoille, still doing his best to minimize the harm done to the Duke of Burgundy's interests, arranged for the city to submit without having to play host to an army or risk a sack. This compromise worked for both the French and the Burgundians, and so, after receiving some supplies from Auxerre, Joan and the Dauphin continued towards Reims. Shortly after, the army left the Auxerrois and entered Champagne. While Champagne was not technically Burgundian territory, it was still firmly within the Burgundian sphere of influence, and many of the towns were guarded by Burgundian garrisons rather than English garrisons, and looked to Dijon more than Paris. But still, the Dauphin's army faced little resistance, at least until they came upon the town of Troyes. Troyes was one of the major cities of Burgundian Champagne, and the city had strong ties of loyalty to the Duke. It was the heart of the Burgundian royal administration under John the Fearless, and of course it was where the Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited Charles and invited Henry V to take his place, was signed. Joan of Arc and the Dauphin called on Troyes to surrender, but the town refused, so the Dauphinist army set up camp around the town and began a siege. After a few days, the commanders debated whether to continue their siege or if they should try to storm the town or even give up and bypass Troyes. Joan pushed for aggressive action, and she prophesied that within 3 days the town would submit. The Maid was then put in charge of the siege, and she immediately set to have the French cannon aimed at the walls of Troyes, as she had the soldiers gather sticks and dirt in order to fill in the city's moat. She made sure that the inhabitants of Troyes got a good view of her preparations so that they would know that a major attack was coming. And the next morning, when Joan was about to begin that attack, the town sent out a delegation to negotiate a surrender. Once again, Joan's aggressive tactics secured a victory, and this time without their usual high cost. Troyes would be spared a sack, but in exchange would allow the Dauphin's army to march through the town, and would agree to give aid to the army as they continued the march to Reims. The other towns that they passed on the way offered little to no resistance, and less than a week after the submission of Troyes, Joan and the Dauphin entered Reims. The next day, July 17th, was the Dauphin's coronation, delayed by war these past 7 years. Charles was anointed with the holy oil used on Clovis, Charlemagne, Saint Louis, his father, and all other French kings, and he finally took his place, unimpeachably, as the King of France. Larissa Julia Taylor writes, quote, "Unlike many members of Charles's court, Joan intuitively understood the political and symbolic necessity of the ceremony. Perhaps growing up not far from Reims, in a frontier region torn by fragmented alliances, she grasped, better than the others, the necessity of making Charles king by the grace of God, anointed with the chrism unique to French monarchs. Once Charles had been crowned and anointed, it could not be undone. He would still have to prove himself as king, but the ceremony at Reims was the first step. And with Charles VII now crowned, I will finally retire my use of the term Dauphin, at least until his son Louis starts making trouble. It can be argued that this ceremony marked the peak of the maid's career. Joan of Arc stood next to Charles during the ceremony, holding her standard aloft, and her family had even been invited from Domremy. After the great lords had done their homage to the king, Joan followed suit, an unprecedented honor for a commoner. She had come to Chinon claiming that she would lead the prince to Reims to be crowned, and less than 6 months later, she had done just that. There were 2 notable absences from the ceremony. The first was Arthur de Richemont, who, as constable, should have held the sword of state before the king during his coronation. But Richemont, despite Joan's attempts at intervention, was still unwelcome at court. The second absence of note was the first peer of the realm, the Duke of Burgundy. Joan wrote to the Duke the morning of the ceremony, quote, "Jesus Maria, great and mighty prince, Duke of Burgundy, Joan the maid calls upon you by the King of Heaven, my rightful and sovereign lord, that the King of France and you make a firm and lasting peace, pardoning each other with a sincere heart, as faithful Christians should do. And if you want to make war, wage it against the Saracens. Prince of Burgundy, I pray, beg, and very humbly request, rather than demand, that you no longer wage war in the Holy Kingdom of France, and swiftly, and in a short time, withdraw your people, who are in some places and fortresses in this Holy Kingdom. And as for the gentle King of France, he is ready to make peace with you, saving his honor if you do not keep the peace. And I would have you know by the King of Heaven, my rightful and sovereign Lord, for your good, for your honor, and upon your life, that you will not win any battle against loyal Frenchmen, and that those who wage war against the Holy Kingdom of France will wage war against King Jesus, King of Heaven and of all the world, my rightful and sovereign Lord. I pray and beseech with clasped hands that you do not make any battle or wage war against us, not you, your people, nor your subjects. And be assured that, however many soldiers you bring against us, they will never win, and there will be great sorrow for the great battle and the blood that will be spilled there amongst those who come against us." This letter suggests that despite Joan's knowledge of what motivated soldiers and commoners, she still lacked some understanding of the court politics that motivated the princes of France. Similar letters written to towns along the way to Reims had proven effective, but this letter, which seemed to lecture Philip the Good, coming from someone he considered to be a heretical peasant girl who had just forced the submission of several of his towns, would have only annoyed him. This letter also betrays the fact that Joan was being actively excluded from the Dauphin's council, as there was currently a near constant stream of counselors and diplomats traveling between Charles VII and Philip the Good, bearing offers much more likely to secure the reconciliation of the princes. Joan's peace would not be one where Philip the Good and Charles VII make concessions to each other to reach a peace. It would be one where Philip the Good submits to the most Christian king. This was not realistic, and for all his faults, Georges de la Tremoille knew that. So while Joan wanted to continue her advance and put more pressure on the Duke of Burgundy, de la Tremoille wanted to entice him. But de la Tremoille was not the only one working to entice the Duke of Burgundy. As Joan and Charles VII were marching to Reims, Philip the Good was on his way to Paris. Georges de la Tremoille's prediction that the procession through the Auxerrois and Champagne would alienate the Duke of Burgundy was spot on, as the Dukes of Bedford and Burgundy reaffirmed their alliance a few days before Charles's coronation. Philip's trip to Paris included all sorts of processions and events meant to massage the Duke's ego, and it culminated in a ceremony dedicated to the memory of John the Fearless and his murder on the bridge of Montereau. This emotional recitation stoked hatred of the Dauphinist faction and reminded everyone of the origins of the Anglo-Burgundian alliance. Philip's support at this point was crucial for a few reasons. First, despite neglecting Paris for much of the past decade, the Duke of Burgundy was still extremely popular in the capital, more popular than the Duke of Bedford and the Lancastrian administration were, and his support could rally the demoralized city, as it appeared to be Joan of Arc's next target after Reims. Second, as first peer of the realm, Philip's support of the Lancastrian regime was a major legitimizer. And third, in the aftermath of Patay, the English desperately needed more soldiers, and that was something that the Duke of Burgundy could provide. To that end, the Duke of Bedford authorized a payment of 20,000 livres to be made to Philip so that he could raise an army from Burgundy, Picardy, and Flanders. But old habits die hard, and even as Philip the Good renewed his alliance with Bedford and began gathering an army to oppose Charles, he was still in talks with the newly crowned king. And similarly, Charles's court was also torn between action against and reconciliation with the Duke of Burgundy. The weeks after the king's coronation marked a break with the rapid advance which Joan's arrival at Orléans had begun. Now the king and his army marched slowly through Champagne towards the Ile-de-France, seemingly uncertain of their next steps. In this period, they received the submission of several more important towns in the region, such as Laon, Soissons, and Provence, among others. But they were also unsure if they wanted to commit to keeping a presence in Champagne, and many in the court advocated for a return to the Loire. Joan of Arc was insistent that a march to Paris must happen next, but the king and his court wanted to avoid a direct confrontation with the capital, and by extension with the Duke of Burgundy. A week after the coronation, a short truce was established between Charles and Philip, which also protected Paris, and, consequently, gave the Duke of Bedford time to raise more soldiers and fortify the capital. Between new arrivals from England, soldiers from garrisons, and men from Normandy and Picardy, the Duke of Bedford managed to muster a force of around 5,000 or 6,000 men, and the Duke of Burgundy still promised to bring more. The English were not in a commanding position militarily, but at least they were no longer in free fall. When the truce ended, Joan of Arc and the captains of the army seized on this opportunity and insisted that it was time to renew their advance. And the king agreed, but did so reluctantly. The march to Paris was full of false starts and saber-rattling from both Charles and Bedford. At one point, the English and French armies even lined up across from each other, but neither would leave their defensive position. Joan may have advocated an attack, but the French captains wouldn't ride out, and she was unable to provoke one. The Maid rode by the English lines, daring advance, but Bedford would not bite. In the end, both sides withdrew, and Bedford made the decision to leave the area entirely in order to defend Normandy. Rebellions had sprung up, and Richemont was causing trouble there as well. As vital as Paris was to the Lancastrian administration, Normandy was the heart of the occupation, and if it was under threat, Bedford would have to respond. So while there was no battle, Charles could still claim victory, and in effect, the English ended up ceding even more of Champagne to the French, and now parts of the Ile-de-France and Picardy were exposed as well. More towns, such as Crépy-en-Valois, Beauvais, Senlis, and Compiègne, submitted to Charles as the road to Paris seemed to open up. As Charles's army seized more castles and towns in Champagne and the Ile-de-France, an arc around the capital began to form, and it looked like a siege of Paris was in the making. But still, the advance was painfully slow to Joan, whose policy thus far had been one of action. Just as it seemed like an attack on Paris was about to happen, momentum stalled again, due to talks between Charles VII and Philip the Good. Just as Charles's court was divided on what policy they should pursue with respect to the Duke of Burgundy, the Burgundian court was divided on whether to make peace with Charles or double down on their English alliance. While the divisions in Philip's court were nowhere near as deep, and the Duke of Burgundy had much more control over his underlings than Charles VII did, the debate still raged. And with both sides uncertain of the best course of action, both played for time. Another truce, this one for 4 months, was agreed to as arrangements for a more permanent peace were being made. While these arrangements wouldn't end up leading to that more permanent peace in 1429, they did resemble the terms which would be agreed to at Arras 6 years later quite closely. In a bit of insubordination, Joan of Arc, the Duke of Alencon, and the other captains of the army resolved to march on Paris, and 3 days later, the army had reached the capital. By now, Joan had experience taking cities, but Paris was an altogether different beast than, say, Jargeau. It was far larger, its walls were stronger, and its population was much more hostile to Charles VII, who they saw as the heir of the hated Count of Armagnac, more so than the heir of the beloved Charles VI. The French capital was one of the strongest cities in Europe at the time. Arguably, only Constantinople would have been harder to take. In the weeks between Charles's coronation and Joan's march on Paris, arrangements to resist had been made. Jean de Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, a capable Burgundian commander, had been put in charge of the defense of the city, and he had been working to refortify weak parts of the city's defenses and stocking up on food, gunpowder, and cannonballs. And while the army that Joan led was large, it was nowhere near large enough to effectively cut Paris off from the outside world. Put simply, it was highly unlikely that the army would be able to take the city without a miracle. But Joan of Arc was as confident as ever that a miracle was on its way. Possibly looking for some more symbolic legitimacy, the French army made their camp in Saint-Denis, the abbey which housed the remains of previous French kings. Charles VII was being pulled in 2 directions. Negotiations between his court and the Duke of Burgundy were ongoing, but to abandon his army as they tried to take Paris would have made him look weak, and might have cost him the enthusiastic support which was fueling his military resurgence. The chronicler Perceval de Cogny wrote, quote, "When the king knew that they were lodged in the city of Saint-Denis, with great regret he came as far as the city of Senlis, and it seemed that he was counseled against the will of the maid, of the Duke of Alençon, and of their company." From Senlis, closer to Paris, but still a ways away, Charles attempted to thread the needle. He was able to prevent an outright attack on Paris, but for several days, skirmishes still broke out. Finally, the king was able to confirm his truce with the Duke of Burgundy, with the addendum that Paris would be fair game. And, on September 7th, Charles VII arrived at Saint-Denis. The next day, the attack on Paris began. September 8th was the Feast of the Nativity, an important holy day where fighting was usually forbidden. For Joan and the French army, the apparent holiness of their cause could excuse their choice to fight on that day, but to the Parisians it was proof of Joan's heresy. For a while, the attack raged. The attackers fired cannons at the walls of the city, while the defenders responded with cannon fire of their own. Smaller guns and crossbows also added to the dangerous chaos of the battle. A few times, the French attempted to storm the gates, but they were pushed back by the defenders each time. Near sunset, Joan was struck by a crossbow bolt and then carried back to the trenches as she demanded to be taken back to the front. Shortly after Joan left the field, the rest of the army followed suit. It was a day of disappointment. The maid was confident that one more assault would have broken the defenses, but the soldiers were exhausted, and the light was fading. The next morning, Joan persuaded the Duke of Alençon to launch another attack on the city, but the king would have none of it. He summoned the Duke and the maid to him, and gave orders to retreat. And to really hammer his point home, he had a bridge that they were planning on using to attack the city dismantled. Charles realized that Paris would not fall to his army, and that no one in the city would open the gates for them. Continuing to attack the capital would only waste men and risk alienating the Duke of Burgundy. Joan had no choice but to comply, and on her way out she left a suit of armor she had taken from a Burgundian knight on the altar of the Basilica of Saint-Denis as an offering in thanks of her past victories, and in hope of new ones. But the Maid was not in a thankful mood as she retreated from the walls of Paris, and this mood was further soured as the Dauphin made the decision to return to the Loire rather than keep campaigning in the north. As the majority of the army withdrew, the Count of Clermont was put in charge of maintaining the French presence in Champagne. But the region had not been completely conquered and was littered with French, English, and Burgundian garrisons. Champagne had been largely free of raids for most of the past decade, but now they would become an increasingly common occurrence as the region became a front line in the war again. The French army was disbanded once it reached the Loire, and Joan was left aimless as the court of Charles VII was determined to keep the truce with the Duke of Burgundy. She was increasingly sidelined by the king and his advisors. The Duke of Alencon soon began preparations for a campaign of his own to try and reconquer his lands from the English, and he requested that Joan be allowed to join him. But this request was refused. The Duke and the Maid were an unpredictable duo whose conduct had approached insubordination a bit too much. Joan had too much influence over Alencon for this partnership to be allowed again. The Maid was kept away from her most loyal supporter, as de la Tremoille and his allies looked to keep her both occupied and out of the way. The defeat at Paris had given the king's counselors, who had always been a bit reluctant to follow Joan, the opportunity to sideline her. Her air of invincibility had cracked, and her aggressive tactics were beginning to be questioned more. While Alencon still believed in her, some of the other commanders of the army began to return to their initial reluctance to follow the Maid's commands. But Joan of Arc was still wildly popular with wider French society and among the common soldiers. Despite the dismissal of the king and his counselors, her story was not over, and she was determined to continue her mission. When she first arrived at Chinon, she claimed that she would lead the Dauphin to Reims to be crowned, and she had done just that. But over the course of the year, she had grown more confident, and her mission had expanded to encompass driving the English out of France entirely. Although she had faced setbacks, the Maid still had faith that God was with her, and she was determined to continue the fight. Thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Duchesse de Nemours; Peter, Duc de Brancion; Elliot, Graf von Gravenstein; Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois; Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau; Mark, Comte de Meursault; Diana, Graf von Beersel; Mehmet, Comte Santerre; Chris, Comte de Seymour; David, Graf von Bornum; Rosa, Comte de Germol; Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand; Quentin, Graf von Blasfeld; Tyler, Comte de Chamaret; Ian, Graf von Arenberg; Eric, Comte de Couche; David, Graf von Barland; Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches; and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois Burgundy on Twitter or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com. And check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.